All right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Parting the Veil. I'm your host, Minus, but of course, this show could not happen without our creative director, Chris Joppa Perkins. So once again, thank you, sir, for taking a little time out and joining us here tonight for Parting the Veil.
Absolutely. Excited to be back. Excited to dig into this topic.
Yeah, it's a good topic tonight that we'll be chatting about. But before we get into that, if you're new to Parting the Veil, I always like to start with this. I kind of want people to understand what the point of it is. The purpose of this show is to discuss design and clarify topics around the development of Pantheon that are often either debated or discussed in the community, or perhaps there's been a lot of progress since there was official words on it. So far, we've talked about the adventuring aspects of Pantheon through items and abilities, our unique taming system, the Pantheon difference, climates and fractures, and quite a bit more that has been sort of wrapped into those topics. So as this is a discussion format, I just want to give everyone a reminder that you can actually download the episodes of these shortly after they're live on your favorite podcast providers as well, like Spotify, iTunes, and more. And you can also obviously watch this on demand on YouTube. But that aside, so Chris, today's topic is a rather large one. It covers quite a few topics, and I've really been looking forward to digging into this since we sort of laid out that this was going to be the topic. So the topic, for those that didn't see, is discussing Pantheon's open world. So I'd love it if you could take us a bit back and talk about the concept of open world and some of the original design conversations that you had back, all the way back in 2015 with Brad, because we know that EverQuest was a zone by zone style world, whereas Vanguard was a much more wide open world. So Pantheon was originally revealed to the community as a zone by zone system, a game. But was that always what the original design documents called for, or was that just limited by, the technology that we had at our disposal back then?
Yeah, it really wasn't a design thing. Our constraints were very much more what was the tech able to do, what was our expertise capable of that we had on the team at the time. So wasn't ever really in the realm of, what would we like to do? What would be our ideal? It was more, this is what we can do. And so this is what we're doing. A couple of years ago when we did the major refactor that we did, it was an opportunity to take stock of where the game was. It was, in the context of, understanding our current team makeup, what we had to fix, what we had to address, who we had at the time to do that, the expertise we had on hand. And it was an opportunity for us to take a couple of steps back and consider, in light of the refactoring that needed to be done, the topic of the zone-based versus the open world, and things that we already knew that we needed to accomplish networking-wise, what we knew we needed to accomplish optimization-wise, naturally brought that conversation back to the table. And because the tech and the expertise was present, it was an opportunity to have more of a discussion about what is the real ultimate vision here? What do we want to reach for and achieve in order to make the experience of Pantheon all that it can be? And that's ultimately where the decision was made. Because as we'll get into throughout this conversation, there are very real design-oriented goals that hinge on how open of a world experience Pantheon is in the end.
Awesome. So you hinted at the network expertise, and that's really, I think, has to do a lot with our introduction of vinyl. And that's really what enabled us to say that Pantheon is now going to be an open world game. So we've talked about the sense of adventure quite a bit for Pantheon. So right away, just from an excitement standpoint for you, knowing your desire for a sense of adventure and traversing the world, what does this do for someone who wants to play Pantheon in an open world setting? And this was actually touched on by one of our community members. Let's jump into our first community question here from Reddit. This is Bison ST. He said, what made the team invest into making the overworld seamless? So kind of a two-part question. Why did we do it? And what does it do for that sense of adventure that we've always had in mind?
Well, adventure really is the key. The sense of adventure that is imparted in a true open world setting and experience is at the heart of the decision, why it was the decision that we made. In a zone-based game, no matter how large the zone is, there is always this sense of being inside of a box. And while there's definitely lots of places to explore within that box, those boxes can be large, and there can be a lot in there to find. There's this abiding awareness that, if I just run along the zone wall of the box that I'm in, that I will eventually find where the funnel point is to the next area, and that is the only way that I can go. Are these funneled access points? There are zoneless games or seamless transition, seamless overland games that, while seamless, don't really fit what I would think of as an open world experience either, because even though they're seamless, even though they're zoneless, they utilize things like mountains or other features to create essentially the same experience, where you have the zoned, boxed in kind of shape and constraint to the zone. So with Pantheon, our exploration systems, things like climbing, things like how we plan to approach swimming and water traversal, and even eventually things like gliding and things like that, they're married to, or they're married with what I believe is more of a true open world concept, because in the majority of our world, there really is no barrier keeping you from moving in any given direction. That, I think, is the fundamental and the important distinction between what I would consider to be a true open world game versus just a seamless world game that still use impassable barriers and topology and things like that to keep you, moving in and only in certain directions.
That, and we see sometimes like invisible walls and stuff like that I know we've talked about on a previous Parting the Veil, that we want to try to eliminate that invisible wall feeling almost entirely if it's possible, right? So with the open world, that kind of goes really well into the next question I had for you, and it's, with the open world, it means you can traverse zone to zone without like a focal point. In a zone game, you kind of just have this like zone line that you hit when you go. Everybody sort of remembers going down a little cave entrance or something, or a pass that lets you get to the next zone. So with that not being the case for Pantheon, how's that affected designing the world? Being that you could potentially go into, I guess we still would call it a zone or a locale or whatever we want to call it, to go from, let's say, Throw 'em Fast to AVP. It's not a singular point or a few different points. How does this affect designing the world, in particular that climbing? Could you climb a mountain and then, if you find a way around it, get into the next zone? And so again, can you take us through like what you have to think about when designing zones?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really big question. I mean, to some degree, it doesn't change everything about it. So when we think about POI, when we think about a point of interest that we want players to find and discover in the world, more often than not, we approach that with I guess you could think of it as like a grand entrance in mind. So where are you meant to, where is the way the actual denizens, boots on the ground in this world would primarily access this point, and we treat that way in a compositional sense. The difference, though, is that it's a little bit of a give and take. So there is a little bit more for us to consider in terms of, there is, in most cases, this kind of omnidirectional approach that players could take. We can manage that to a degree, and do manage that to a degree, where we have locations that are meant to be very difficult to get to, very difficult to access through certain means. So we can systematize things like climbing as a gate, in that sense, to say, you have to achieve this degree of climbing skill, or this kind of itemization to be able to, actually make it to that point. But what it also does is it gives us a lot of freedom. And in a sense, it's almost kind of a mindset change towards an embracing of freedom, where one of our mantras is that we don't want to over design. Part of the overworld sense, or the open world sense, excuse me, is that there is kind of this freedom, and if I dare say, a little bit of messiness to the way that players, when they're truly free and able to move around and access the world as they please, they're not always going to enter in through the grand entrance. Sometimes they're going to find a way through the back door. Sometimes they're going to approach things, and often in non-conventional ways. And so we have certain parameters that we have to keep in mind, knowing that climbing allows for such a larger degree of access point and engagement with areas. But ultimately, it's a real sense of freedom that it imparts to us in the design sense, to really allow players to kind of tell their own stories of how they've accessed and what they've been able to do. And I think entrance and exits and things like that are actually really an interesting phenomenon in Pantheon in terms of how all this works out and plays together. I think of a good example like in Breath of the Wild, a game that I obviously love and that embraces this kind of open freeform climbing, where the Temple of Light, for example, kind of the vestigial Temple of Light, there's a main entrance into that temple, but you can climb all over the freaking thing. Like you can climb up on top, you can drop in in the middle of kind of some of the holes in the roof. Like there is a way to go in, but then there's also all of these additional kind of ways that you can engage, and I think that's cool. The other really neat thing about it, in kind of a different angle here, is that it gives us freedom to evolve parts of the world more slowly. So because of the vertical element of these areas, some having more than others, we will still absolutely have wide open plains and areas where there's much less breakup of the terrain with height and elevation and things like that. But we are able to, in that sense, we don't have to wait for an expansion or even a major patch update to just add little trickles of things here and there in the world to keep things fresh. There's ample opportunity, nooks and crannies, and places that players should expect to see somewhat of a more dynamic approach to content and things kind of coming about, in these areas, sometimes unexpectedly even. So it's a pretty cool prospect for us on the design side.
It's also pretty cool too to think about like somebody who does find that alternative way in, but then maybe the enemies that they meet when they get in on that other side stop them in their tracks, or they're not quite ready to handle. There could be those real fun aha moments, like I made it. Oh no, I'm going to come back here later type of thing. So It's pretty neat. And I think, it's safe to say that there'll be things that need to be looked at, but then ultimately giving the player the ability to do that, to discover. That's what comes with it, right? I think that's why so many game studios have gone away from the discovery aspects, because they want to make sure they're controlling the narrative, but allowing the players to have a little bit more of that narrative back while making sure nothing breaks the game, but things like that. So continuing with this trend of, climbing from zone to zone or passing through zone to zone, with the open world, will we see weather be fairly consistent as you're traveling through zones in an area? So if it's raining in Thrown Fast and it's raining where we climb over some mountains in AVP, do we see a transition of that weather, or will it be semi-connected? What are the plans for our weather systems?
Yeah, weather will be localized to the zone. And so if it's raining in Thrown Fast, there is a way that we can, tether zones together, especially zones that are meant to be more connected. So Thrown Pass and Avendir's Pass have a very natural connectivity. They feel like extensions of one another in many ways. So we can essentially determine how many zones in that sense would be connected to one another and therefore sharing the same weather event. But it is on a zone level, you should say. And so if you're running through Avendir's Pass and it's storming, but it's not storming in Silent Plains, then there would be that period once you cross over into Silent Plains where visually you would transition out of that storm into whatever the weather is in that new zone.
Awesome. So getting into what I would call our first big question of the night. Very big topic all around, but this one is one that's been debated in our community quite a bit. So another part of the open world change is we've been able to test Vinyl's performance with over 500 players in Throne Fast, all leveling in the starter area and all very close to one another when we first sort of debuted what Vinyl's capable of. And that's where we went from, like, we had 3 pre-alpha servers and we went to a singular server to host all our players. And it was a big moment. We weren't sure what to expect. We were excited and it worked out pretty well. So if we can start to handle large sizes like that, and as Vinyl even improves further, one of the topics that's brought up a lot is when you have that many players running around competing for enemies, mobs, bosses, whatever it may be, in an open world, where do we stand on the 2 different mob claiming types, which is first to engage or most damage done for claiming that enemy target to a group or to a player?
I mean, just to keep it super simple, this is not a decision that we will make definitively until at least alpha. We need more players. We need more personalities. We need an influx of new blood and a bit of the chaos that ensues from that before I would be comfortable making a definitive decision. Programmatically, coding wise, it's not a difficult thing to do. It's essentially the flip of a switch that those 2 systems can change. So philosophically, it comes back to the question of what kind of social dynamics are you driving between the 2 kill credit approaches. Most damage done has its own benefits socially, in that you're directly competing with somebody. There's a little bit of that social tension that keeps things in check. There's a bit more of a personal volition that has to occur, that you're going to compete with this person. You're going to contend with this other real person over this target to try and do more damage and therefore take the credit that way. But in so doing, you're encouraging social interaction. You're encouraging that kind of tension that occurs and that can be healthy and promote more of a vibrant social experience. But you're also introducing a lot more opportunity for griefing, for toxicity, for things of that nature, as opposed to the first to tag, meaning like the first person to inflict at least a point of damage onto a target now has credit for that, or that person's group, and then that determines where the kill credit goes from there. That too has its own benefits and also its own disadvantages, if you will. And so right now we are using a most damage done model to kill credit in our play testing. We plan on having a season of time where we convert that over to first to tag. Once we get again into alpha and we have more of a critical mass of players in these areas, and then we will be making a decision based on lots of other criteria as well, as we see that play out in alpha. So it's one of those decisions that it matters, it's important, but it's not urgent. There's not a critical urgency to it to get it nailed down right now. It's something that we want to be thoughtful about, that we want to take time and have as much, making an open world game in 2023 is, these are the kind of decisions that you have to make very carefully and very thoughtfully. We'll have something more definitive on that a little bit down the road.
And is it safe to say that we may even see it end with a combination of things because of like boss mobs or things like that having a potential different style to regular enemies? I mean, is that the type of testing where I do that it could be one or the other, it could be both?
Essentially, I mean, ideally you would want a homogeneous approach just for clarity and simplicity. It's an option. It's an option to have, certain types of mobs or encounters handled differently, but I'd like for us to land on a single approach if we can.
Okay, cool. So we've talked a lot about NPCs, the persistency. Can I call them that? Is that a word? How persistent our NPCs are at chasing down our players. We see it in pre-alpha. We've talked about it. Let's just say they don't give up easily. And I think that's one of the nice little things about the style of game we want to make is it's not simple to just run through a bunch of enemies and be safe. You got to really watch where you adventure. And you've talked in the past that some enemies will persist longer than others, but I'm curious, and I'm actually going to throw up question number 2 here because it really tied into it. How has the seamless zones, this is from Keller and Winters, how have these seamless zones affected your plans for Mob Leashing in any way? I think that's asked because in the past, players who had a zone style system, your way to get away was to zone. So what are your thoughts? Has that changed anything in Mob Leashing for us and how far mobs will chase players?
Yeah, it has. And we've talked about this. We talked about this at some point. I'm not sure. I don't feel like it's been that long ago, but we do plan to have mobs leash. Now, the important point to make, because when people hear that, they immediately assume, I think, in large part, that it's going to be this kind of one-size-fits-all leashing mechanic. And so every NPC will leash in the same way at the same time, after the same distance, that kind of thing. For us, it's not going to be that way. We want to lean into the leashing more as a feature, more as a mechanic, than just a kind of a static solution approach. What I mean by that is different NPC types, different mob types. So think, for example, an animal versus an undead versus, humanoid. That will play a role often in the leash behavior. How long are they going to pursue you? How effectively are they going to pursue you? How fast? Things like that. Then you have the disposition layer. You have the trait layer that also provide opportunity to fold in different kinds of leashing, different kinds of pursuit mechanics on that level. And then what we discussed in the last time as well was on the baseline of leashing, also having variance built into that, to where you're not typically going to see even the same mob type, the same NPC in the same area pursuing you for the exact same distance or length of time. That there would be some built-in variance there as well, just to keep it from becoming kind of a rote and eventually trivialized thing. But yes, we do plan to utilize leashing 100% in the overland, where you might see us do kind of a holistic rule change with leashing to where we may not have leashing at all, would be in something like a dedicated dungeon. If you remember, we've discussed that dungeons are going to, as you're moving through the world of Terminus, you're moving seamlessly through the overland. But if you enter a dungeon, you're going to hit a hard zone line and you're going to load into that dungeon. And once inside of that dungeon, because it's a much more constrained area, because there are hard zone lines, then it's very possible that we might remove the leashing mechanic from the NPCs in those areas, or alter and customize that leashing mechanic to fit kind of the zone that it's in. So I think that would be the main point takeaway, is that we are planning to lean into it more as a feature to utilize and to create some interesting dynamics within the game, more so than just a kind of a static solution type mechanic.
Well, you kind of answered the next question I had for you, which was sort of, and just to clarify for everybody. So we'll still see zone lines for raids, dungeons, that kind of thing, and kind of put people into those dungeons with what people would be more comfortably familiar with in that style. Okay. Well, Chris, this next one, hands down, is going to be the biggest topic we discussed during the stream.
Oh, yeah?
And this is a big one. I've even seen chat already talking about this thing. So it's a big one. You and I have actually discussed this, little backstory. I've discussed this for a very long time, way before I joined the Pantheon team. While Pantheon was striving to be open world, it's hard to deny, from my perspective, that very specific things, and again, in my opinion, this is not Chris here, I'm not speaking for you, things like maybe really epic boss encounters or story events can really benefit from instancing. So we've talked back and forth on this a long time. If people could have been a part of some of the chats we've had, where does Pantheon's design stand right now with instancing? Does it have a place? And the final part of that is recently you've talked about this a little bit during your interview with Disparate Worlds, hinting at layering as well. So lots and lots to unpack here. I'll stand back and just kind of let you riff on this topic a little bit. I can't promise I'm going to stand back, but
you'll slowly back out of the room. No, this is a great question, a great topic. Where to begin?
Everyone's holding their breath.
Well, let's deal with the elephant in the room first, which is the what I imagine for perhaps a good portion of our immediate audience, that the word instancing is a bad word. It's a word that I have just seen raked over the coals. It's something that, I'll even go as far to say that I think for a lot of people, their interest in Pantheon to some degree involved an emancipation from instancing, from kind of what has been a long series of MMOs that have taken instancing and embraced it and just completely inundated themselves with it. So I want to start there. That this is I know this is a loaded topic because there's a lot of very charged feelings about this and expectations for what happens to games when they employ instancing of any kind. I think that's the general consensus or the general perception. So I guess maybe the best way to approach this would be to kind of take you on a tour of Terminus and to kind of try and explain and contextualize the ways that we are planning to embrace instancing to a degree. So as you move around Terminus in the open world, in the overland areas, you are not going to be in an instance. The only caveat to that I need to say and restate, this is another statement that I made on the Disparate Worlds stream recently, or the interview recently, and that is in Pantheon's launch period, when Pantheon launches, and as with any new MMORPG, it is inundated with people. You inevitably have overcrowding issues, and some games, some studios decide to handle that by spinning up lots and lots of additional servers to provide other places for players to filter into. I think personally that is a bad move.
I agree.
The reason being because the population that would have been on the initial server is essentially split in half, because half of those people move to the new server. And then, as with all MMORPG launches, whether you're talking about the most, fringe, unknown indie offering, all the way to something like World of Warcraft, there is, in every case, a significant drop-off of numbers after the first couple of months of active players. And so what happens is those initial servers that were overcrowded lose a large portion of their active players and end up being about half full. Those overflow servers that were spun up end up being even less full because of all the people that have moved over there. And then you end up with a situation where there's a lot of empty or close to empty ghost town type servers. What I think is the smarter move is to, for a limited period of time during that launch period, to allow for a sharding instancing situation with zones. So if you've got 1,000 players trying to log onto the same server, then you spool up 10, 15, 20 different instances of Thronefast until that population goes down. And once that goes down below that certain threshold, then you revert to what is the planned way, which is having a single zone and not. And I said this last on that interview. I personally hate that when you have different shards that are kind of spooled up with the same area, so you don't know if you're in Throne Fast 1 or Throne Fast 15, and you're trying to get with your group. I really don't like that, but I think that's a better approach to handling initial overcrowding. Other than that one caveat, which again, to be very clear, that is a temporary mechanism to handle initial overcrowding, not a permanent approach. We will not have zone shards, other than in that very specific circumstance until those populations become manageable. Otherwise, so back to the tour. As you play Pantheon, as you move throughout Terminus, you're doing so in a non-instanced, open world, shared way. You come to a dungeon. Like I said earlier, when you enter that dungeon, you hit a hard zone line and you zone into that dungeon. The dungeon that you zone into is non-instanced. It is open world in the sense that any other player on the server can enter into that same dungeon with you. Where we are planning to employ instancing is when it comes to the boss rooms of our dungeons and our raid areas or raid zones. And there's a lot that I want to unpack here just to make what that means very clear, and also to define what we mean by instancing. So start off again. Our dungeons are open. They're non-instanced. You will find in our dungeons rare mobs, rare NPCs that are part of the non-instanced dungeon, meaning they are contested. They are, things that you have to try and find, and there may be other players there. All just what you would expect in an open world, non-instanced sense. But most of our dungeons will have at least one premier boss type NPC. This is more than a named rare mob. This is a boss type NPC. So I'm going to use an actual example from Pantheon, which is Halnir Cave, and I use it because I think most of our immediate audience anyway has seen enough of that zone to know. So Nashra is the main boss of Halnir Cave. He is a fallen prince of the Bane, and he is in his own room. His room is set up for the kind of encounters that go on during that fight, and it's in its own kind of area. Nashra is, and Nashra's room is the kind of room I'm talking about here when I say that this is something that we would instance. Elsewhere in Halnir Cave, you have two lesser wraith NPCs, kind of the lieutenants of Nashra, if you will, Tirasura and Ashbaron. These are not major bosses. They're not premier bosses of Halnir Cave, but they are named rare NPCs, meaning that they're going to be sought after. They will have elevated loot tables. They're going to drop, stuff that players are going to want to get. But they're not going to be in instanced rooms. They're going to be part of the greater open dungeon. Now, the other point I want to make here is usually when people think of instancing, they think of an area that you can access essentially at any time. It's just kind of a gateway, if you will, that you run into it and you enter into the instance area, and it's always up, it's always accessible. You just enter in as you please. When you finish doing an instance, you come out and you just run right back in, and you just kind of rinse and repeat that over and over again. That is not how we plan to handle it in Pantheon. But there's going to be kind of a couple of different scenarios that we would employ. So in the case of Nashra, for example, well, actually, let me even back up a step further. The exception to what I just said would be in our lowest level dungeon. So it could be the case that in the lowest level dungeon, if there are any instanced rooms, instance encounters in those lowest level dungeons, then they probably would be more of kind of an always on accessible area, or at least have very low barrier to entry. But going back to Halnir Cave, in the case of Nashra, there would be, in that case, a special kind of way of unlocking access to his room. And what's interesting about the Nashra example is that in some cases it will be more of a kind of a public thing, a shared kind of opening, if you will. So the way it would work is to be able to access Nashra's room, you actually have to kill both of those lieutenants. So making sure that Tirasura and Ash Baron are both slain is the key to creating a period of time where Nashra's room can be accessed. And at that point, there would be, some kind of an event, some kind of a, kind of a at least at the very least, kind of a chat, kind of a global zone-wide message, probably with Nashra's voice or some Nashra's words that are alerting the zone that, okay, Nashra's room is open. And then at that point, groups would be free to enter in and engage with that. But again, they would enter into the instance of Nashra's room to engage with that. In other cases, there would be, it wouldn't be a public shared event. It would be something where a group who's wanting to access an area would need to either in that dungeon find different items that would drop off of different NPCs or complete different quests that would give different items that would need to be brought to like a pedestal or some kind of an altar or something to unlock access for that group to enter. So in that sense, it would be a group specific, entrance into the instance, and therefore not a shared kind of opening. I'm trying to keep this as simplistic as possible. So we just to recap here so far, we would have examples of an instance room that there would be more of a shared access. More of a shared access to that through some kind of event in the zone, like killing the two lieutenants, for example, opening up access to Nashra's room for anyone that wanted to attempt that. We would also have several examples where there would be specific access to individuals or groups who would accomplish what needed to be done to enter into that room. I will stop there. There's more I want to say, but I feel kind of fire hosey right now. So do you have, any questions or anything that I've missed from chat or anything that I could go back and check while I silence my cell phone here? Yeah.
So for those that don't know this, we talk about questions, but Chris specifically said, I don't want to give you too much info what I'm going to say. So I know some of it, but so we wanted to have more of a natural back and forth here. So first I want to say that I love it. I think that there are mechanics and things that could be very difficult to put into a game that can challenge players if there's just a bunch of randoms running around distracting you or setting off spell effects or whatever it may be. And some of those really in-depth fight that require coordination and your team to be on the same page. It gives an awesome opportunity to have that moment still in Pantheon. So I personally really enjoy that. And I think like kind of a follow-up question, Chris, to that, like, you've talked a lot about wanting to have meaningful sessions that don't need to be people like me who might play, 15-hour sessions, but you want people in a 2-hour session to be able to achieve something in Pantheon, to be able to have a moment of happiness. So, or triumph. And that doesn't mean they're going to get to do everything. We're not trying to make it quickly bypassable for just someone to jump in, get everything and leave, but to have different moments that would appeal to those player types. Do you feel like using these, I don't know what to call them, these moments of instancing, allow for that to be a little bit better, or allow for a guild to potentially plan a night? Sure, they might still have to do some of the unlocking pieces, or maybe they have items they've saved up to get in for that one attempt or for that certain period of time. But do you think it plays into that ability to give players a meaningful 2-hour session?
Mm-hmm. That's definitely a big part of it. I'm not going to shy away from saying that we are not interested in the days of needing to spend 12, 24, 36, 48, 72 hours locked into a nonstop gaming session only to reach the end of that and have nothing to show for it. We're just not interested in that. We're not interested in the burden of playing and progressing in Pantheon being about how much we want to respect the player's time in that sense. We don't want it to be only the spoils go to those who can completely box other players out because they have the stage of life or the opportunity of life to literally sit on something and keep it completely out of other people's hands. We also want to, one of the things that having these premier boss encounters being in an instance setting and is that it allows us to go so much further mechanically and ultimately in how we create challenging, complex, multifaceted encounters to where the challenge is more on how difficult the content is to complete, and therefore that being a determiner of how prevalent the loot, for example, is from that target versus how much time can you sit and kind of roost on top of something and box other players out. So the burden is less on how much time do I have to throw at this versus how skilled am I, how skilled is my group, how skilled is my guild to actually be able to take on this content. Because I know there will be concerns about, if something is instanced, doesn't that mean necessarily that the loot from that is going to be more prevalent because it's, you're not having to contend with other players and compete for those resources? And the answer can be yes, and it can be no. Cooldowns and lockouts on instances are part of it. So for example, it's most likely not the case. And certainly as you get into higher and higher level content that you would be able to just rinse and repeat, Nashra, for example, over and over again, that if you successfully complete that encounter, you do what you need to do in there, whatever storyline related, loot related, task related, whatever it may be. Once you exit the room, you're not going to be able to turn right around and go back in and do Nashra again. There will be a period, most likely, whatever. And I saw some questions in chat, like, so does that mean if like random group A kills Ash Baron over here, and then 10 minutes later, random group B kills Tirasura over here, does that mean Nashra opens up for everyone? In this approach of instancing that we plan to utilize, yes, that is the case.
It's kind of a cool social dynamic on that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's kind of a zone-wide event. Like, okay,
yeah,
and then you can make use of that. But that's one example of one way that you would see it. And in that case, you complete the encounter, you exit, and then you wouldn't be able to enter again until that window that was opened through that event closed, and then it was opened up again. In other cases, when it's a different mechanism that opens access to the instance, there might be a different form of cooldown. And this is obviously something we would be able to communicate to the player when they try to enter in again. But there's the component of how often can you access it, how repeatable does this become, and managing that. But then also the difficulty, the challenge of the encounter itself, being something that, as most of you should know, we plan to really dial up in this game. We want this game to be challenging. And even these bosses, we want, even the lower level dungeon bosses, we want them to, part of setting them apart in this way allows us to really kind of approach them with more of a premier kind of a mystique and a presence to them.
Awesome. Well, that's a lot. It's a lot to digest. It's a big topic. We really haven't talked very much on before, so I appreciate opening up. We have quite a few questions to get through for our community, so I know we've spent quite a bit of time so far on these topics. So I'm going to go through these questions. Feel free if you want to give quicker answers or as in-depth as you want to go. I don't have anywhere to be. But let's go with our next question here. This is actually from Disposalist on Twitter. They said, in regards to boss mobs, because you were talking about that, And that doesn't mean just like the instant boss mob, like rares and specific rares to dungeons or areas. Will there be multiple ways or maybe multiple locations at times to find some of these bosses for players of different types to enjoy the content?
Well, and I don't know why this just triggered this in my remembrance, but this is something I did mean to say as well. We do still plan to have some true open world contested content. We do still plan to have, whether it be a world boss or other examples of things that are really truly that classic kind of right place, right time, first come, first serve kind of thing. We just don't want that, and are not going to have that be the main fare. We want those to be more special circumstances, but still plenty of opportunity to flex on those. But yeah, there is going to be I'm thinking of best ways to answer this question. And another thing that this allows us to do is for those premier type boss NPCs, it does allow us to more effectively control how they are engaged in terms of what size force is brought to bear. I know a big concern has often been, what are you planning to do about just zerging and 100 people coming in to fight this one NPC? Yes, there are other potential avenues to take, and as far as basically either the mob running away or summoning extra help or different things, but I think it fits much more cleanly in this overall paradigm where, if we say this is a single group raid and we've tuned it to be a single group raid, then we can actually create a single group raid type experience that is able to be dialed in as such, but is so bleeding edge, razor's edge difficult that, but we can get it dialed in literally to that degree of difficulty because we know exactly how many players are going to be contesting it at one time. And that's a kind of a special case situation. But
let me interrupt you for a second, because I think what you just said has been a really important thing for me, is that there's a big difference between locking things out by not letting people try it or not letting people in, which we've seen a lot in the history of MMORPGs, versus giving people a shot at it, but that doesn't mean you're going to clear it, right? So we've seen really hard to get to boss fights that are locked down and you just never get a chance. But then there's also boss mobs that everyone's had a chance to go at and they just can't win. And I like that dynamic of sometimes it's going to be skill based. You may have the opportunity, but it doesn't mean it's going to become a loot pinata, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So just back to that question, just so we make sure disposal is answered. In a dungeon, can a rare mob spawn in multiple locations or potentially be spawned in different areas, or do you think they'll be more fixed to where they're going to spawn?
We have a couple of mechanics in mind for that. More of a essentially, there's going to be a mixture. There are some NPCs where it doesn't really make sense that they would be in different locations. And then some that are meant to be more roaming. But again, these premier type boss NPCs are the ones that are going to be the ones that you would find kind of in these locations, and they would have, in most cases, requirements to be met to be able to access those areas. Whereas, as I also said, we still plan to have plenty of rare and named NPCs that are meaningful targets for loot, for progression, for other things that exist in kind of that traditional sense that, yes, would often have different spawn rules and more than one spawn location.
Cool. Next question here is from Elk. It comes from Instagram, and this is an interesting question. I thought this was a really good one. What are your plans to make an open world dungeon as interactive as we've seen in instanced ones?
I think our plan, I mean, the best way I could answer this is to say that the plan is to do it very similarly, but just to make peace with and allow for the social open world, my actions can have an effect on other players' reality. We talked a little bit about this when we've talked about the gate in Wild's
Mhm.
End, how because of the waterways and the water channels through the gate, and the idea that you can pull a lever or push a button and have those water levels change, or those the routes go in a different direction, and how that could flood a room that wasn't flooded before, or empty a room that was. That these are the kind of things, you'd typically see in an instance dungeon, but we're going to do it in a non-instance dungeon, and there being some of that give and take, some of that communication going on there. So yeah, if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's that we want to embrace some of that same interactivity, but we're doing so eyes wide open, in that we're not an instanced dungeon game.
So getting back to open world with the next question here, I understand, one of the things that's hurt a lot of games world size is, fast travel and those kind of things. So we have a question from Instagram. I'm sorry, from YouTube, actually, from Steak MCC. I like that. Steak MCC. He says, they say, as a character advances, how will modes of transportation differ from a less advanced character? So how can, as someone grows, will they find a way to be able to traverse a little quicker, but not make the world less meaningful?
Yeah, great question. Yes. The answer is yes. Make the world less meaningful. Do you mean
The
like
size,
not shrinking
like the size.
the world?
Yeah.
So,
for example, for those that don't know, we obviously, you've made a very big stand against flying, right? Because flying would trivialize everything. So just how do you make someone who's able to travel the world a little quicker as they advance, to where it's also not just skipping content and still having to enjoy the world, so to speak?
well, this is where, there may be some people that disagree with me on this, but I do not think being able to traverse the world more efficiently, more quickly, and even to a degree skip or avoid content is, I don't think it's a bad thing. I don't think it inherently shrinks the world. I think it's a very good thing. I think it's a very powerful part of the progression paradigm for a game like this. Just about anybody who's played EverQuest has their tale of the first time that they traveled a long distance.
For sure.
The human city of Kanos to the human city of Freeport is one that's a tale often told. Traveling from anywhere on Antonica to the boat, on the boat to Fadeware, to either Butcher Block, or then further on foot to Kelethin or to Akanon. That these are tales often told, and told with great affection. And then you have to remember at the same time, though, that EverQuest existed as a game that offered very substantial movement speed buffs, that had pretty significant teleportation abilities. And as you leveled up, as you got higher level, your access to those things became more prevalent. They were available on items at later levels, and there was actually quite a bit of travel. Not to mention Bard Song, and how Song of Travel, especially where it's combining speed and levitation and visibility and all that stuff, how that aided with travel. And never did you hear somebody complaining that the world was feeling too small, or that travel was feeling trivialized, even with all of these things in place. You also then take a look at something like classic World of Warcraft in that era, and they took things and went even further and said, okay, we're going to have all these same kind of mechanics, but then we're also going to introduce flight paths. We're also going to introduce mounts at an earlier level, and the ability for all players to have personal speed. And I would argue the same thing, that I think WoW never stopped feeling like a big world. It never stopped feeling like travel didn't matter, even if you were just clicking a flight path, and yeah, you had a really long one where you're sitting there for 10 or 15 minutes. That was faster, it was more efficient, but it still didn't take away the sting of travel, the fact that I've got a long flight ahead of me, and the world maintained its size and its scope and its meaning. I think it wasn't until flying mounts that, and I think flying mounts actually is the first time, in my opinion, that you could argue that the world started to feel smaller and less meaningful. Because when you give players sovereign control of the z-axis, and you allow them to elevate themselves completely out of harm's way and move freely on that plane, I think that's when you've crossed the line. So it's one reason why we will never have flying mounts, not to mention, you know, how it flies in the face of what we're setting up with climbing and all that stuff. So with that said, that precedent being said, getting my thoughts together here, we do plan to have quite a few traversal movement related points of progression. So if I were going to walk you through a very quick framework, at the lowest levels, most of the things that you want to access are nearby, relatively speaking. So your need to be able to move more quickly through the world, it's not as prevalent. It doesn't feel like as much of a part of the progression right away, but it's still there. And so what we've done is we've introduced the sprinting mechanic as kind of your very first means of that kind of self-sovereignty over your movement speed. So you have this ability to sprint anytime that you want, increases your movement speed a little bit, and helps you get around, helps you get out of danger, so on and so forth. Once you get to about level 10, that's when you're starting to, you know, for the most part, think beyond your starting area, the starting zone that you're in. You're thinking about adjacent zones and moving further into those. That's when you're going to start to see kind of that next tier come online. So, for example, with the shaman or other class abilities that can start to be incorporated in that travel paradigm. So the Wind Strider ability that the shaman has, what that does is it increases your sprint speed by 30%, which is pretty significant. And then it cuts the endurance cost of sprinting in half. So you can sprint essentially twice as long. So you have that first taste of being able to move more quickly through the world by means of, you know, another class that can help you with that. Not to mention there being other, you know, movement speed buffs that other classes can offer as well. Once you start to get into the teens, the late teens, the early 20s, that's when eventually the taming and the taming system will be coming online, where players can start to, you know, dabble in finding certain animals that they can tame and ride. That's where you're going to see, you know, even more abilities come into play that can increase movement speed and things like that. Climbing at that stage with itemization and skill is going to start opening up, you know, new avenues vertically to access new areas. And it's also that time that you'll start to see in the 20s-ish your first teleportation type abilities, and those being communicable, where, you know, you're going to be able to hitch a ride with a druid or a wizard to certain locations. And that those paradigms and those tiers kind of continue on as you get into, you know, the 30s, for example, and you start, you know, seeing the introduction of gliding and the ability for players to glide through certain means that we'll get into at some point, you know, exactly how that's going to look, how it's going to work. Gliding is very different from flying mounts. I've gone into it at least a couple times before, why they're different, but they are. But at the end of the day, I firmly believe that part of a very real and important sense of progression is not making it the world smaller, not shrinking the world, but increasing and empowering the player with more and more options and abilities to move around the world more freely, more quickly, and in a more enjoyable, interesting, fun way. It is in itself a loop that is very important to these games being healthy over long periods of time, because believe it or not, there are a lot of people that play and enjoy these games for more than just the min-max grinding. They are there to engage in these worlds. They're there to move around and be in the world. And the more you can enjoy doing that, the more you can open up options for yourself to do that, the healthier the game experience is going to be. So I do not have a concern with having multiple different avenues to increase player mobility and speed of mobility and options they have for moving around the world. I'm not even particularly concerned with the mechanics that we have in mind for too much content trivialization or bypassing content. But at the same time, again, at the end of the day, it's an open world in the truest sense. So for the most part, if you can find a way to traverse something or find a way to bypass something, I really don't have a fundamental issue with that.
Awesome. You kind of answered this next question, but I want to give them a shout out on Twitter, Chiro Dude. So they were talking about effectively meeting up with friends. So you've kind of hit on a lot of that, even at low levels, possibly getting some of those buffs or that social mechanic of getting help, right? Through some dangerous areas and things like that, or following a group that might be traveling. I wanted to bring this up still though, because one of the other things that I think did make worlds smaller, it started with flying, and you're correct there. But then the fast travel mechanics, like looking for a group that put you in a dungeon or immediately sent you somewhere without having to do anything or talk to anybody. We've been pretty adamant that those things won't exist in Pantheon. I just wanted to bring that back up and let you speak on it if you'd like. But also, would you say the best way you're going to be able to meet up with your friends if you're from different starting cities from across the world is going to be carefully and potentially seek out help until you're a little bit more powerful?
Yeah, carefully, I think is a good word. I think it's a good word. I can think of a couple, Dark Myr, for example, and in Cyrani's Rest, where that's set up geographically is going to be a little bit of a challenge. But again, the cool thing about the Dark Myr is that we have the opportunity, because of their race type, to have actually some underwater passageways that they can take to, expedite their travel and do it more safely. Where they've built out these underwater tunnels and passageways that they can actually swim through. So think of kind of like an underground tram, for example, but it's more you're swimming it as a Dark Myr to get to places like Skargal, which is going to be kind of that coastal area where you can take that ship. So I'm not going to get into a whole lot of that right now. That's pretty bean laden, but there will be some travel involved for sure, but we are also making sure that it's not an insurmountable task. Being able to, if you are just dead set on being a dwarf starting in Kadasa, or like a Dark Myr or an ogre on Rainfall, but you are dead set on meeting up with some friends that started on King's Reach, then there will be a way to do that. And that will be a relatively straightforward way to do that. That will involve some care, taking some care, and a little bit of time, but definitely doable.
It's awesome to hear. So the next one's right in line there. So talking about those starting cities, we had on Reddit, Valiant Jedi asks, will several races be able to start in the same cities if selected? So will a race be able to start in different cities depending on their faction or alignment? Almost went math there.
No, we actually do plan on races starting in their own cities. You're not going to see elves starting in Thronefast or humans starting in Kadasa.
Oh, that's a really nice little beam there. I don't think we've talked about that before. Very definitive.
And a lot of that, that is very lore driven in the sense that with the way civilization has kind of come together and the frail age that they're in. They're not long out of the sanctums. They're not long out of the the Deicide War and these massive things that have occurred, and so there isn't there isn't that kind of like hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years of coalescing and things like that going on. So some of the races even being very, very, in the overall context, very freshly displaced. Still a lot of mistrust, a lot of there's just a lot of dynamic. Now, will you see other races in other cities? Absolutely, or nearby. That's a big part of like kind of the feel of the world is whether it's emissaries or merchants from Fairthale, setting up shop and thrown fast and things like that. Absolutely. But yeah, characters will start in their respective starting cities.
Awesome. Next question's a big one. You don't have to go into crazy depth here, but have at it. So from YouTube, Jazz and Blues asks, will there be interesting ways that we can interact with the open world when we don't want to quest? I mean, you can just rattle off all of them. I know there's a lot of ways.
Yeah, I'll do my favorite one, the one that is, well, one of my favorite ones, and that is being a scavenger. I love the idea that, and I'll name drop Breath of the Wild here again, because it's it really set a love for this in me. But I love how in that game, and I know it's not the only one that has this, but where I can run around and look for things in the world to pick up. So I'm playing Pantheon. Maybe I'm fighting in a bandit camp or whatever, and myself or my group, we take out all the bandits in the area. I love the idea of seeing their tents and their structures and their crates and bags and some treasure chests and some different things, and going around and being able to find things, find a dagger stabbed into the top of a barrel, find a little chest with some valuables in it, find some food or some supplies or different things. And the key though is that there being a chance that you could find something valuable, or dare I say a chance you could find even something very valuable. Now, you're going to find something that's like on par with the premier boss in the nearby dungeons, best weapon. No. But the fact that you could find a rare gem, or find a rare crafting component, or find a rare item, or a rare piece of armor on an armor rack somewhere, that possibility makes that a very compelling loop. And so when I think about if I've only got 30 minutes to play, or I've only got an hour to play, or I've had a really rough day and I just feel kind of antisocial, or I just want to unwind or whatever, but I want to be in Terminus, I want to be in the world, and I want to feel like I'm able to do something meaningful, then for me, scavenging and building the world in a way where there are these lootable prop items that have these different places that they can spawn, these chances for finding some rare things that you could sell to other players for a good bit, things that you could actually use as an upgrade, that if you're lucky enough to find them. I think that's one of currently what I would say one of my favorite things when I think of interesting ways to interact with the world when I don't want to quest or don't want to get into a group kind of thing. That's what I think of.
Love it. Then we obviously have crafting and climbing and the adventure aspects. I mean, there's a lot. I think there's a lot that you can say. So before we get into the last question and wrap up here, just as a reminder, anybody who's watching the show on demand or listening to the podcast, obviously Pantheon's a crowdfunded game. So we just really appreciate anyone who shares out content, who lets their friends know what they're checking out, whether that's over social media or following us on social media. And for those that want to support us and help us get this game to completion, obviously check out pantheonmmo.com, and we have pledge options on there if you want to support the game. So, but like I said, there's a lot of ways to support us, whether it's following us, commenting, being part of our community, or pledging. So I just want to say thank you to the community for being here tonight, having fun with us as we get into the last couple questions. So, the last question here is it's on topic, but it's a little off topic. But the reason I wanted to include it is because it stemmed from that same interview that you did with Disparate Worlds. So that it kind of like what brought up the whole instancing discussion, brought up a lot of some of these thoughts and you and I talked. And this was actually submitted on our Discord from First. And First said, some of us were concerned when in a recent interview a cap size for guilds was brought up. Can you clarify? So we talked a little bit about this, and I said, I think this is something good to kind of discuss where it's at, where it could be heading for those that might be concerned that they're going to have very large guilds, and if the cap could influence their ability to get together.
Yeah, this is a good example of what can happen sometimes when you literally are just saying the kind of what's in your mind from the most recent conversations that you can recall about a topic. And I just want to stress very strongly that when I mentioned the 100-person cap on guilds as a potential cap, it was very, very strong emphasis on potential, very strong emphasis on not set in stone. Something, I would put it even below, well, definitely below the kill credit decision of most damage done first attack. Whether we cap guilds at all, even in light of some of what we've discussed tonight regarding the utilization of limited instancing and things like that, it could very well be. And again, as we get into alpha and beyond, we'll be able to better make the call on that. But take it with a grain of salt that there would be a cap, and take it with a grain of salt that if there is a cap, that it would be that amount. That is something that not only are we not set in stone on that yet, but that's something that we will benefit quite a bit from player feedback and kind of a greater, more dedicated perspective on that when the time comes. So
awesome. Thank you for clarifying that. I think that will settle people a little bit. And I think you brought up an important thing that sort of relates to earlier is there's things that are important, right? There's a lot of really important decisions to make, but not all of them are urgent, that they need to be made now. And like you said, as we get more players into the world, as we see some of those things like we talked about with first to engage versus more damage done, it's just going to be something that we think is important, that we have thoughts on, and we have a certain way we want to lean. But as we test it, there's room for growth in how those things look. So, Chris, this has been a really good episode. I hope the community enjoys it. I'm looking forward to some of the comments that we're going to get and some of the discussion. So before we wrap up for tonight, I just wanted to ask you and give you the mic for one final moment here. Is there anything that you wanted to sort of mention or discuss or recap before we close up the show?
If there was anything, it would just be to, if the topic of instancing is one that feels like a struggle to get behind, my ask would be, listen to what we've talked about tonight carefully. Really consider the specifics behind the ways that we're looking to employ it, and try to find as much as possible that balanced perspective on how it can be utilized with overall the health, the longevity of the game, its player base in mind. Because I believe that the ways that we're looking to employ it are meant to both, number one, uphold as much of the shared open world experience as we can, because we believe that it's valuable to do so, but also meant to make sure that what Pantheon is at its heart meant to be, which is a game that can be enjoyed, a game that can be invested in by the people playing it, that can be planned for and engaged in a way that allows people to actually make time for it in their lives. That these evolutions, these specific balances towards employing a system like this in the ways that we are meant to account for that. So that would be my ask, my hope for those that find maybe that it's a little bit of a struggle. But yeah, other than that, I hope it was a good stream for everybody. I hope it was clarifying, and I look forward to the conversations and the feedback.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Chris, for spending time with us tonight. And thank you to the community for hanging with us a little bit longer tonight. Next week, we will have our newsletter coming out next Thursday. You'll be able to check out our roadmap to alpha with our producer's letter that will go out with that. So excited to give everybody some updates. And if you didn't see on our website, we actually put out a pre-alpha recap. You guys can start looking forward to that every month now that we are doing a pre-alpha every month. You'll see some recap and information that we put out there for people to check out. So keep your eyes on our socials for the link to that. That should be coming out soon. I think the link is out there in Discord if you want to check it out early. But once again, we'll talk to you guys as we always do next week. Chris, thank you so much. And can't wait for the discussions that are going to come from this.
Yeah, same. Thanks so much, all.
Take care, everybody.